Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nichols.
And today on the show, we're talking about the Healthy Homes Act. Now, we've talked about this before on the show, but I want to take a slightly different slant. And this has come from a listener of the show, Manuel, who's actually even been on here and said, Ed, I've heard that some new properties that have just got their Code of Compliance certificates, can still fail the Healthy Homes Act. These are the new regulations that set minimum standards around heating, ventilation, drafts, these kinds of things. So talk to us about this.
Yeah, which is interesting because you'd assume that anything that's built to the building code would meet the Healthy Homes Act that the government's introduced. You'd think that they would run simultaneously, and they don't, because they don't care about your own house. You can live in a drafty house with no heating, but you cannot put a tenant in there.
Well, this is the interesting thing. Now, what I thought I'd do to make this real is go through the whole property management book, so all of the properties at the OPA's property management firm, which is Venture Management, and see what have they failed on. And how many have failed? Because about 75% of the properties under management at Venture have been built in the last, say, 7 years. So let's get a sense of what they fail on and how many fail. So I've gone through each of them. And of the...
Now, is this all of the ones that we've had tested so far?
All of the ones tested.
Right, so we're about halfway through.
So there are 380 homes on the spreadsheet I was given. Of course, some of them that are coming through, some will be still under construction. We may not have taken over yet. But of those, 294 properties were tested. So of those 294 properties, only 56 were already compliant, 100%. So that's about 15% were already compliant. 85% of those tested needed something to be done to them. And again, vast majority have been built very, very recently and have had their Code of Compliance certificates released over the last 7 years. So what were these issues, and what was the number one issue? Well, 49.2% of them failed on drafts. And I thought, how can mostly, newer properties fail on drafts? So I've been talking to Linda, our property manager, who runs Venture, been on the show, and she was saying that with a lot of newer properties, there is a door that goes from the hallway into an internal access garage. And if you've got a bit of a gap at the bottom of that can facilitate a draft.
How much draft does there need to be?
Well, there are some minimum standards. I don't know the exact one, but what I do know is that...
How do they measure the draft?
It'll probably be the width at the height of the gap between the bottom of the door that goes from the hallway into the garage. Now, it's quite a cheap fix. That'll cost about $90 to just put a bit of a draft stopper at the bottom of that. But this is the level of detail that your property inspector or your Healthy Homes inspector should be going through into to understand whether this property is meeting the new Healthy Homes standards. Next up is 112 of these properties, which is 47%, have failed on insulation. And again, you think, how can so many properties fail on insulation? And it's because, again, the standards are quite rigorous. So if somebody has been up into the roof and perhaps they've stepped on some insulation, then part of that insulation may need to be replaced or topped up because there are minimum amounts. It's measured in what's called an R value, this insulation. There are minimum heights that insulation has to have. There are minimum R values. So if somebody stepped on it and it's a bit compressed, that might need to be topped up. Similarly, somebody might have been up there rummaging around the lights, and there might now be...
Centre.
Perhaps. Then there may be gaps that just need to be rearranged and filled.
And yeah, I learnt this the other day. So pink bats often over time will slump, and so even if they're in a wall cavity, they can tend to slump down and so need to be topped up. And or I had some really interesting cases where some investors built some properties in Tauranga, and the building company had subbies that were putting the pink bats in, getting the council sign off for that, then they were whipping them out and putting them in the next place, getting the council sign off, and so on and so forth. Terrible. Well, the great news is we managed to get all that remedied for all of those investors because we went back on builders' warranties. But it's just interesting that whilst you think something's new and perfect, sometimes you do need to do those checks. And actually, it's kind of prompted me to think about another step in our process where you have an independent builder go and do a building report, even though it is brand new and even though the council signed it off, because these things, how would anyone know unless you're looking for them?
The other interesting thing, and I don't know the exact R values, but the level of pink bats or insulation that you need differ around the country. Obviously in Christchurch, it's a bit colder, and so you would need more insulation. compared to if you are up in, say, Whangarei, where it tends to be a bit warmer, which is just an interesting quirk of living in a long, skinny country where the climate is different across a lot of the country, depending on how north or south you are. Now, what's interesting is another 88 or 37% failed on heating. And what happened here is this could be if you don't have a big enough heat pump. Now, I want to talk about some actual specifics here because I know actually one of Linda's properties on Geraldine Street in Edgware failed on draft and heating. And what the comment came back is that they needed extra 2.3 kilowatts required in the heat pump. Now, this is a property, a small unit that's built in the 1970s, a block of flats. It's 80 square metres in total. It's currently got a 4.5 kilowatt heat pump in there and a 6.8 kilowatt is needed. And Linda, who's obviously got a lot of experience in properties and knowing what actually makes a healthy home, said, look, this is going to be totally overspec for what is, in essence, a very, very small couple of bedroom unit. But what she did say is, well, I don't need to do it until 2022, and by then maybe I will have moved into it, and I perhaps won't need to meet those standards if I move into it. Sure. Which, again, is another interesting quirk. Something else that I want to talk to you about is about a property at Riccarton, which is an older property built in the 1970s. This is on Hanau Street. It's in a block of two flats. And again, another quite small house. Now, this failed on heating as well, but it only requires less than 1.5 kilowatts to build it up. Now, in this case, what they'll do, because they only need a small amount of heating to meet the standards, is they'll probably install a panel heater, so one of those ones that go up on the walls, which might cost them $250 to make up that difference. But here's a quirk from you, and I want to hear what you think about this, Andrew. If your property is built after July 2019, so if it was built in the last 15 months or onwards, and it fails on heating, then you must replace the whole heat pump. Whereas if it's an older property, it was built 5 years or more ago, or 2 years or more ago, then you can just top it up with additional heat pumps or additional units in order to make up the correct kilowattage that is needed in order to meet these standards. But you can't do that for newer properties. Yeah. I find that strange.
Yeah, I do too. And so that's where you do have to be really careful if buying off plans or a brand new property, because the expense of replacing a heat pump is far more significant than topping up with wall panel heaters. And so definitely that's something that you'd want to make sure that you got right the first time. It's certainly something that we spend a lot of time focusing on and actually have in our contracts now a clause to protect clients that if someone doesn't put the right heat pump in there, we can have them remedy it rather than have a client have to pay for them.
Exactly. And just to put that into context, the extra 2.3 kilowattage that would be needed for Linda's property, where she's actually going to have to reinstall a new one, if she was to do that, that would cost her about 2.5K.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, if you put that into the context of
$50 a week for the first year.
Exactly. So it's going to be pretty, it can require quite some investment to start meeting these standards. Let me talk about what came in at number 4th place, which is ventilation. So 78 properties failed, which is 32.8% of the properties under management. Now, this can be really interesting because I want to tell you about a new build which was in Rolleston. This one failed on draft, so I'm assuming that's the garage, plus ventilation. I said, Linda...
Surely the draft works to ventilate.
Well, here's what was wrong with the ventilation, because I said, Linda, how can a property that was built in 2019 fail on ventilation? And she said, well, again, what happened here was that the extractor fan ducting was squished. Somebody had stood on it. Squished.
Oh, right.
So somebody had stood on it, or it had been compressed, something had fallen on it, and so some basic maintenance was needed to be done. Yes. But of course, if you haven't gone up and looked at the ducting, you don't know that that's been squished. And there's nothing this investor would have been able to do to be able to figure that out, because they're not inspecting this. They're not expecting this property themselves. They're not going up into the roof. A property manager is going to inspect it, and they're not going to get up into the roof. That would be that's not something that would come under a usual remit as a property manager. So this process is finding some maintenance which is probably required in order to be able to meet these standards, but nobody knew about it before. So we're finding things that you wouldn't initially think, oh, that's an unhealthy home.
Yes, and actually it is really interesting, the ventilation point, because when you have a brand new property, they are pretty airtight. So nowadays you do have new issues, which is often condensation or something. So if a tenant who's living in a property doesn't open the windows and ventilate the house, you do have condensation build up that can lead to mold or mildew. So it's really important that you do have appropriate ventilation. So whilst this is a pain in the butt, it is actually quite a good thing, because you don't want a mouldy house, you don't want to have to deal with that kind of thing. And I've seen a property which has resulted in poor ventilation, and they just become gross.
And just to go over what those 6 things that we're failing on with them in order. So first of all, it was drafts, that was about 50%, then insulation, heating, ventilation came in at number 4, and the last 2 which weren't as popular were drainage, and then only 1 failed on the windows not being able to be shut correctly.
Right.
So that would have been a one-off issue, because there was only 1 property there.
So giraffes and bats, it sounds like a zoo.
The interesting thing was, is that what your joke was before?
Yeah, you didn't get that.
No, I didn't get it at all. The interesting thing was the ones that came in at number 5, so drainage, that was 63 properties, which is about 27% of the properties that were actually inspected. So the drainage would be things like leaves that were stuck in the gutters. There was another comment for one property that there was some vegetation being built up in the guttering or in the drain pipes. I just found that it's very interesting, the level of detail, which no tenant's ever going to notice this. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not saying here that you shouldn't do it.
When they get a $4,000 payment from the landlord, they'll notice it.
Well, I think this is the interesting thing, that there are things within these standards that you wouldn't normally think that's going to necessarily be an issue, or that's going to stop this property from being a healthy, warm, dry home. But these are what the regulations are, and we as landlords need to meet them, which is the interesting thing here. So I hope this has been useful insight into what your properties perhaps may fail the healthy homes standards on. And it's really important that you do get these inspected and find out which dates you need to meet in order to be compliant with these standards. Fantastic. Let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you've got a topic that you'd like us to talk about on the podcast, whip out your phone and give us a text. Our number is 5522, and if you text that number within New Zealand, it'll come straight through to us so we can have a chit chat, and we'll even talk about your topic idea on the show. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
I'm Andrew
And we're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.